Hey guys, how are you all doing? Welcome to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Naruto was raised as Yautya warrior and got harem with Kushina and female yautja movie. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, modify the Lifestream, link is in the description, also subscribe if you enjoy the video. Let's start the story. I could hear them chittering, crying out, as we slaughtered them. My ears caught the bellows of pain and victory as my blood brothers and blood sisters fought against these monsters. I felt the air, hot, humid, oppressive around my body, droplets of perspiration forming on my armor, only to collect and stream down it as I ran, my large legs pumping and carrying me through the dark, sticky tunnels of organic flesh and carapace, killing everything but my blood siblings as I went. My blade sung and monsters screeched as I cut through exoskeleton bodies harder than steel, felt claws and teeth and tails tear and rip and shred futilely at my armored body as they tried to stop me, trying to protect their birth mother, only for me to cut them down mercilessly. I felt their blood splatter my armor, its corrosive properties eating away at the alien metal, a last defense to slow me, even if only slightly. My armor shrugged it off, made of a special metal, rare even for our kind, and immune to their acidic blood, and my best defense against them. Another one of them flew out of the darkness of tunnel, desperately trying to defend their nest from us as it attacked me, only to screech as I flexed my left wrist, the double blades running its length, making a steely hiss twice as the doubled in length to nearly 4 feet before I drove the blade up and into the descending bug, piercing its chest and sliding out through its shoulder blades. Yellow, acidic blood flowed from the wound as it thrashed around on the end of my wrist blade, but I simply watched it as it impaled itself deeper, coming closer to its own death. But these creatures cared little for their own. It was the queen, her life, and the life of future generations that mattered. It was quite a strength, and I hated them far more than any other prey I've encountered. I felt no pity as its struggles began to cease and the body went limp. It wasn't dead, however. I twisted my wrist to the right as I tore my arm out sideways, watching in glee as the blade's curved edges tore a bloody chunk out of its side as its body, as it dropped in front of me, its screeching reaching a crescendo before I slammed an armored boot down on its elongated head, crushing its black exoskeleton and turning its brains to mush. I continued my trek, leaving the smoking body behind me as its blood ate away at its own flesh. I fought against more of them as I lumbered my way through the tunnels, paying scant attention to them as I absently cut them down, my mind on other things. I blinked away the slight fog in my mind as I came to the opening of the tunnel I had chosen, knowing that all tunnels eventually reached the inner hive and the nesting chambers of the queen. Walking out of the opening, I growled at the sight of hundreds, perhaps thousands of eggs. Strewn across the walls and floors were the bones and corpses of unknown races, most likely the previous top species of the planet. They were attached to the walls by coverings of mucus and wall membrane, anchoring them to the spot. Their chests had all been blown out, their ribs cracked outwards, and dried or fresh blood coating them and around the openings. Their deaths may have been a necessary one, they may have been a part of the great circle of life itself, but I would never wish such a death the host creatures suffered to bring these monsters to life with. I got to the chamber first, but the distant sound of blaster fire and roaring that grew clearer and louder informed me that my clan members were catching up. This was the most dangerous part of our mission, and I would take chances with our success. I still thought it was fun, though. I flexed both my wrists, a copy of the double wrist blade shrinking from its sheath on my left forearm, while an additional pair of single blades shinked from my elbows and curved under my forearms until they reached the same length as my forearm wrist blades, as well as being a bit thicker and not possessing as many warping curves in the blade's edges. I was now in possession of 3 blades per arm, the only one of my clan and our history to do so. I felt my back shoulders twitch slightly, even as my shoulder cannons detached from their positions flush against my back and swiveled upwards until they rested coiled over my shoulders, my targeting system coming online as they hummed with energy. I glared up. And the nightmare in front of me, the reason we had come to this desolate world. She was enormous, standing anywhere from 20 to 30 feet high, and if the bitch wasn't anchored to the wall by her egg birthing sac, she was around 50 to 70 feet long from her arrow-headed tail to the end of her wide crested head. She was midnight black in color, her exoskeleton the same shade and hue as that of her children. She had enormous taloned feet that gave her upright walking movement, but lay tucked underneath herself near her egg sac, an enormous yellow liquid-filled tubular protrusion that housed her species developing eggs before she laid them, and they hatched. She had 2 pairs of arms, 2 of them jutting out from massive shoulders and heavily muscled with multiple clawed digits, while her other arms had only a few fingers and were much smaller and frail looking, jutting out from her chest. Her head was sleek and oblong, like that of her children's, but she had an enormous fan-like crest that jutted out and merged itself along her skull, her curved mouth slightly reminiscent of a smile, bearing fangs that could tear apart nearly any of our strongest armor. I knew that she knew I was standing before her as she turned her head and stared at me with her eyeless head, the skin over her mouth curling back as she bared her fangs at me and hissed softly in warning and slight curiosity a dozen meters away from me, and I felt her begin calling out to her remaining children to come to her as quickly as possible. Her species had slight psychic abilities, a mind linked to one another, and she used this to control and communicate with her brood from any distance, from several feet to the other side of the planet. This was their greatest strength, to be as one mind and to all move towards their purpose. However, I too have this link, and if I so wished, I can speak to them as if I was one of their own, one of her children. She was currently calling her brood back to her, telling them to cease fighting the intruders and kill the predator in front of her, the one that carried the metal weapons and wore armor that they could not pierce. And her message held, to my astonishment, fear. It seems she must be a long-lived one if she knew so much about us. She must think I'm different from the others. Differences to them meant I was deadly. I confirmed it for her myself, directing her attention to me as the greatest threat to her own survival as I opened up a link to her and spoke to her about her fate. Listen, brood mother. I have slaughtered many times what you have birthed of your kind and many of your own children. I have your link that makes you strong, and that what you fear most is capture by my kind and then your children taken for our prey. But you have no fear of capture this day, for we are here to hunt only. To kill all your children, all your future children, and you, as well, brood mother. She understood me completely as she started thrashing around and screeching, desperately calling for her children to come and protect her, but they didn't come pouring out of the tunnels as they would normally from a nest of this size, as we killed the vast majority of them. Those that answered her call would be slaughtered before they reached her, and even if they escaped my clansmen, I'd turn them into smoking, bleeding corpses myself. I took my time approaching her, my boots crunching on the bones and flesh beneath me as I walked at a steady pace, my blades glinting slightly from the dew that collected on them from the humid air, and my armor clinking as it thumped against my thighs, even as a small vicious grin worked its way under my mask as my targeting laser beamed across the scattered eggs. Followed by a sapphire plasma ball from my cannons, switching targets and thrumming as they fired again and again, an inferno growing as I randomly the destroyed eggs around me, setting them aflame as the hot plasma burned its way through eggs' tough outer shell and boiling the face huggers inside them alive within their own liquids. Her outraged screams as I killed off her future brood brought a vicious warmth to my heart. I stopped several meters away from her and far out of reach of her tail and simply stood my ground in front of the enraged queen, studying her for a few moments before turning my head towards the crunch of heavy boots. I knew that even behind my hunter's mask my blood sisters knew of the vindictive smile and that they were happy for me, especially my mother. I nodded once as they nodded back before I resheathed my wrist and arm blades and powered down my shoulder cannons as they jerked slightly on their mounts before swiveling back down to lay flat against my lower back. Their own cannons hummed to life as they peeked across their left or right shoulders depending on their personal preference, their targeting sights lighting up and shining in the darkened room as they moved across the queen's skin, each stopping when they found a specific target. Each of us waited, and within a few minutes our blood brothers had also arrived, as well as my adopted mother and father, and they fanned out into position, forming a semicircle around the queen as their cannons light up, and soon the queen's body was peppered with the targeting retinas, 3 small dots in the shape of a triangle. I was courteous enough to open up a link to the mother in her final moments before we killed her, as well we were going to kill her, she was prey, and we honored those we hunted. We have many more hunters than you, and you will die this day by the combined numbers of our clan, Queen Mother. She screeched at me once before the clan opened fire on her, the blue and white plasma spheres reducing her body to acid, flames and ashes, and her rage-filled screeches turned to screams of pain. Me and my blood sisters are particularly sadistic, and even as they were killing her, they always found their targets on non-critical points of the body, simply wounding her and drawing out her suffering. Me and my mother had the most reason to absolutely despise the queen and her species, and my blood sisters took up that hatred alongside us. Within minutes the queen's body was nothing more than a flaming carcass, oozing acidic blood and quickly burning up into ash, smoke and soot as me and my clansmen quietly left the death-filled hive, our objective, the complete and utter obliteration of the xenomorphs colony that had infested this planet and wiped out all other living species, save for use as food or breeding stock for their parasitic life cycle. We trudged our way through the humid tunnels before coming to the clan's ship, and we all boarded, both the walking living and the carried dead, and those that had fallen in battle, as warriors would be remembered, while the others who simply died would be forgotten. Even as we crested the planet's gravitational pull and began another trip through the vast expanses of space, we all watched, from the young bloods to the elder bloods, as one of our brother suicide sub-nuclear bombs went off, incinerating the hive and reaching hundreds of miles away before eventually glassing the planet. It was specially made for such, as we wished only for the parasitic bastards to have few worlds which they could call home, and those that breached their quarantine worlds, by accident or hitching a ride, were either obliterated or we took the queens, and then glassed the planets back into a primordial stage with nothing but bacteria left alive. I smirked as I watched the hive disintegrate before turning and regarding my clansmen. The majority of them had already left, going to do whatever they would, and I was left with my mother and blood sisters, my adopted mother and father already having vanished. 3 of them were around 7 feet tall and had hair in black tentacle-like dreadlocks, their skin having a greenish-yellow cast with the occasional stripe or spot pattern, depending on the clan member. The skin not covered by armor was scarred or unblemished, depending on the sisters. And they were my sisters, as their armor's chest area was widened at the upper part for ease of comfort, and they were also a bit thinner than our brothers, lacking the extremely developed muscles they had, though that didn't mean they were any less lacking in strength or ferocity. They just weren't as pre-geneticated to have the strength like our brothers did. They may have towered over my other sisters as well, but I was even bigger than them, topping out around 8 feet, which was a record for our clan. Haha, even amongst my family I was unique. But such a body was the result of what Yame believed to be a childhood accident, as well as my own genetics. However, our trip was done, and we were no longer required to wear our masks, and they began to unclip them, first going for the breathing tubes at the side of their masks, before unlocking them with a slight hiss of air. I followed suit, my own scarred and decorated mask unlocking, as I held it gently between my hands, and I observed my blood sisters. They were all of varying ages and even species, but they were family, and they would be those I would love and care for above all else. Blood Sister Two Steps, Blood Sister Quarry, and Blood Sister Carrion were all part of the Yautja species and were the ones who had introduced me to their elders. They were all heavily muscled, loaded down with weapons and heavy armor, and had their black hair braided into dreadlocks like all members of their race. They were family because they were the children of my adopted mother and father, and they looked up to me as an elder brother, being born after I became a clan member and growing up hearing the stories of my hunts, challenges, and victories in the arena. My other sisters were humans, or Terrans, as we were also called in other parts of space and by other races, and they were the ones who had come with me when I left my former home. They had their own human names, but went by the names our clan gave them and wore said tribal names as badges of honor, though we used our real names in private. Sister Blood Drinker wore a more revealing female hunter's armor configuration, but she said it was for mobility. Her arms, chest, things were armored, the rest of her clad in steel fishnet, a carryover from her previous life, and had painted her armor a sandy tan, as well as wearing a large tan trench coat that reaches mid-thigh. Her hair was pulled up into a spiked tail at the back of her head, though a single braided dreadlock lay across the back of her neck in between her shoulder blades, and a necklace bearing a large talon-shaped fang lay around her neck. Sister Mind Crusher was Sister Blood Drinker's best friend at our former home and wore just as revealing, though it was a bit more conservative female hunter armor, and she had small, ringed shoulder and elbow pads painted a dark crimson with white streaks running through it. She and her friend were some of my favorite sisters, and they often played and looked after me when I was an unbloodied youngling. This was incredible, as I was an outcast from the place I was born. Her black hair lay messily down her back, broken up by the pair of long dreadlocks braided into it. Sister Sword Dancer had purple armor that was heavier and far more covering than the other 2 sisters, and she carried a long, sheathed katana across her back, a memorial from our past home, and one of the weapons she carried, as sentimental value, as using it in combat, would shatter it with the prey we hunted on a regular basis. Her hair was nearly as dark as Sister Mind's, though it bloomed with a natural purple tint, and a single dreadlock lay near her brow, reaching down and over her left shoulder to her chest, while a black swirling tattoo stood prominently against her left shoulder, a mark that showed her previous rank at our old home. Sister Miracle Hand was a bit smaller and not as well endowed as the others, but she was just as much a fighter as the others, though her talents were more towards healing than killing. Her armor was more conservative, and under it she wore dark baggy clothing that covered a great deal of skin, though she could also hide many weapons. Her armor proved more defensive ability than the other 3, covering much of herself in armor, but still allowing her flexibility and agility. It was colored a dark green with black highlights, and she too had a dreadlock at the side of her face like a sword, though it lay across her right shoulder instead, her black hair mingling with the color of her armor. Sister Backbreaker was by far the physically strongest and most well-endowed of our sisters, easily outmatching even the clan elders in single or multiple unarmed combat, and was the oldest amongst our group, though she looked only a bit older than the others. She wore dark green armor that was a bit lighter shade than my other sister's armor, with slight purple highlights, as well as a splash of violet across her mask. Her blonde hair lay a bit past shoulder length, and her 2 previous ponytails had been transferred into a single, large ponytail at the back of her head, and then braided into a long dreadlock, as per yautja custom. My last 2 sisters were some of the most influential, both physically and mentally in my development, and played the biggest part in my life besides that of my mother. Big sister Firestorm had left her family and clan on Earth to come with us, her previous mate being the main reason for her leaving. She had also already had a pair of young ones already, but they acted like her former mate did, and they wished nothing to do with her. This hurt her quite a bit, and me and my sisters continue to do what we can to help ease and erase the pain she suffered from them. She wore dark blue and black armor, and a small pinwheel symbol was etched into the shoulder pads and over her heart. Big sister Silent Echo is one of the reasons I'm still alive today, and also why I joined the yautja as one of their own. She wore dark crimson armor with black highlights, and her crimson hair lay long against her back and reached her thighs, and had been braided into dozens of long thin dreadlocks with gold rings, instead of the typical black rings that were standard. Her fingers were clawed, and they drummed idly against her chest as she smirked at me, her ivory-colored fangs peeking out slightly from her crimson-painted lips. Her cheek marks flared slightly against her caramel-colored skin, stretching and thinning with her expressions, even as her pointed fuzzy elfin ears twitched occasionally, the fur the same color as her hair, while 9 long fuzzy tails of the same shade unraveled from behind her as she stretched, her bright crimson eyes alight with desire as she sidled up against me and nuzzled my neck with her cheek, her arms around my waist as she began to purr, my own fingers gently running through her locks and occasionally brushing her tails or ears, her skin and fur warming with my ministrations. She and all my sisters were very beautiful. She cuddled against me as I watched the last of my family remove her mask, and while she and the sister pressed up against me had the same eye and hair color, their personalities were quite different. After all, a mother's gaze is very different when compared to that of a mate's. Her eyes shone with pride and love, and her smile was kind and warm compared to the vicious smirk usually gracing my clinging sister's face. Her hunter's mark was worn with pride, the scar faded, but deep against her brow above her eyes, a pair of fang-like marks, the first pointing upwards and over the right brow, while another lay underneath it and arched downwards towards her eyes. My mother's and other sisters' marks had healed over, while both mine and the foxy attachment to me had healed, but were colored the blood red of our blood from after we'd used the xenomorph's acidic blood to burn away the skin and mark ourselves to become adults. She wore white armor, a startling contrast to that of the normal gray armor, and was even a direct opposite of my black armor. She was Kushina, my blood mother, both in yautja and human terms, the woman who had brought me into this world. I was grateful for the love and support she has given me for all these years. She was more than just my mother. She was also my confidant, my friend, and one of my mates. I would do anything for her, providing warmth and comfort for her, or butcher anyone who dared to harm or insult her. While most societies would frown upon such ideas of close family love going beyond platonic feelings, but for the yautja race, females looked for strength, honor, and successful, deadly hunters for their partners. There were no such barriers as blood relationships. If a female's brother was a stronger warrior and she herself was successful in hunts and could birth a strong brood, they would pair with one another. This was also a known custom at my old home, as many of the human clans had paired their clan members together to make their blood stronger and to protect and advance the bloodlines, so it bothered us little. And having more than one mate was also acceptable. The oldest and strongest warriors have at least 3 mates, and so long as they could protect and provide for them, they could have as many as they wanted, which they did in order to secure their bloodlines into the future, provided they would keep their ranks. Females were also known to switch mates when one would die or was beaten at a challenge by a stronger male, but there were a few that stayed with their first mates. Even as I detached my own mask, I felt my family twitch as their base desires awoke, their bodies fidgeting as they waited for me. They had a strange habit that I found both relaxing and pleasurable, but it was only done if we were alone, as we all transversed ourselves back to my personal quarters that I had once only shared with my mother and Silent Echo. I sat myself down as my sister continued to nuzzle and purr against me, placing my scarred and decorated mask against my lap, and I sighed as they immediately went to work, their soft fingers running along my neck and cheeks, stroking, scratching, and tracing the 3 dark and thin slash marks that decorated each of my cheeks, and I groaned slightly as my body began to relax. And the tension left my muscles, my eyes drooping slightly as a low, but audible, and contented purr making its way from my throat, a mix of both the clicking growls of the yautja language and my natural kitsune genes. I felt my mother gently place herself in my lap, her fingers gently working against the clasps of my heavy armor as the others too began to work at them, and she intently watched each of the clasps slowly click and then slack as they opened up my armor further to them. Her fingers tapped a steady rhythm against the metal as she worked before working their way upwards as she began undoing her own clasps before my fingers took over for her, helping her as she had me. My sisters were shedding their armor as well, and even as they squirmed their way into my embrace, I thought back. Back to when I was still a child. Back to when I was hated, despised by those that I was sacrificed to protect, and I had only my mother and a few others to support and protect me. Back before the hunters and monsters had come. Such a long time since the day the hunters came. Such a very long time since the day I became a yautja warrior. October 10th, year 6798 of Imperial State, year 42890 of Basic Interstellar Date. Screams of terror and cries of pain reverberated through the streets before being drowned out by a soul-crushing roar of a demon, its 9 tails swaying to and fro as it tore its way through concrete walls, claws and fangs tearing and shredding the concrete and wood and the occasional body as it was swarmed by shinobi. Buildings collapsed as its paws crushed them, shattered the concrete, wood and steel of their architecture, the buildings collapsing around the limbs, the rubble thrown outwards as the kitsune removed them and continued its trek. Its tails flattened entire blocks as they whipped about behind it, its fangs glinting as it snarled under its breath, the sound rumbling through the streets and into the hearts of the shinobi it slaughtered. Most peculiar about it were the pair of blood-red eyes with slit pupils that lit up in glee as it killed and decimated, though the flickered gold occasionally. Flying and weapons sailing as the shinobi tried desperately to stop it, only to scream as its tail slammed them into a bloody pulp, tearing them apart as it crushed them underfoot, caught them with its fangs as it ripped their bodies to pieces before swallowing them, and all manner of natural disasters forming around it. Tornadoes formed from the movements of her tails before a flick sent them roaring across the village, gouging paths of destruction as she let them loose to do as they pleased. The tail slammed into the earth, splitting it up the middle, the earth rumbling beneath her as the split widened and then took off, tearing its way deeply across the village and through a wall, collapsing it hundreds of meters away and then curving and moving up over the cage's monument, missing the faces but tearing great chunks of granite and basalt away from the cliff face. Only to drop down and crush those underfoot. Her tails curved and twisted as they rubbed against one another before sparks of static began to build until its fur crackled with energy before arsing upwards from her massive body and streaking towards the black clouds forming their way across the sky until the sun's setting rays were even swallowed up. And then it rained lightning. She roared as it danced around her, her voice sending sound waves that deafened them and knocked over some, while the bolts of energy struck shinobi and building alike, setting the shinobi screaming as it contacted their bodies for several seconds before they exploded in thunderous detonations as their liquid insides boiled from the massive heat and energy before escaping them. Then turning them into bloody, steaming chunks of flesh, while the buildings simply exploded and showered the Terrans running around her like insects with white-hot slabs of superheated metal and rock. They were becoming an annoyance to her, these ninja shinobi. She had learned much about them on this backwater planet, watched as they evolved from their previous world of advanced weapons and technology that could kill billions at the drop of a finger into the of their old culture that of hand weapons and the skills of their own bodies instead of relying on machines to kill. They were interesting, learning to adapt and eventually control the natural energy their bodies produced inside themselves, advancing rapidly after the first of them discovered it and realized he could use it as a weapon. And shinobi were born, using their chakra to command the elements and surpass the limits their bodies imposed on them. They were trained assassins. They were mercenary contractors. So she had settled here for a time, observing and learning about this form of energy from them, training in their techniques and skills, and when it suited her, borrowing those that developed the bloodlines to see what had mutated in their DNA to form such unique abilities. And while she now had dozens of sealed blood samples, she could do little with them, as the planet's technology was so behind even that of a newly colonized planet. As interesting as she found them, however, they were still pathetic in their fighting ability, and while she had dealt with demon hunters in the past, not a single one of them ever put up much of a fight, and try as she might, she could never cause enough havoc for a shinobi village to send their forces after her. So she took it upon herself to make them. She grinned as she opened her mouth filled with razor-edged fangs before bubbles of dark red chakra began seeping from her body and swirling into a small bowl in her mouth, even as it kicked up a breeze around her. She found great amusement as the shinobi immediately pulled back as the ball pulsed and then doubled in size before doubling again as she craned her neck upwards, the massive sphere crackling as it turned black before shrinking to its original size as her tails fanned out behind her and then arced towards her head and she clamped her jaws shut and swallowed the sphere. Wisps of chakra-laced smoke began to drift from her partially closed mouth as the inside of her throat glowed and the concrete and buildings under her cracked and then exploded as her weight increased and she dropped dozens of meters into the ground before dropping again as she doubled in size as her body puffed up before puffing up again. And again until she was several times larger than her normal form. Her cheeks puffed as she opened her mouth, chakra exploding from her mouth as it arced its way in a straight path across the village, vaporizing anything that came in contact with the chakra before it smashed into one of the far walls and exploded upwards into an enormous half-sphere, entire blocks of both people and the building rubble that were once their homes vanishing in an instant. Her mouth smoked slightly as she returned to her normal-sized form, but any further fun was suppressed by the arrival of a boss summons and she growled in both agitation and pleasure as she finally found someone worth her time on this pathetic planet infested with weaklings. At least the cage of this village was strong, unlike the immeasurable number of shinobi she fought and killed along the many years she'd roamed the planet. She had listened in on the rumors and legends surrounding the Leaf Village's fire shadow and was intrigued. Scaring a village into withdrawing from a multi-country war by decimating their shinobi ranks himself and establishing the Konoha shinobi themselves as the top village with such a victory. Her pleased mindset was halted as what amounted to a sting on the skin when the blonde slammed a swirling massive chakra into her forehead before jumping back to the giant toad Gamabunta he'd summoned for battle as it healed immediately and Konoha warriors dodged in different directions as she lashed her tails out after them, carving great tears in the surrounding area as they missed and dug through rock and concrete. She growled as they performed a synchronized jutsu with the toad spitting out a stream of oil at her as the blonde lit it on fire before it engulfed her body. She grinned as their cheering at her supposed injury cut off as she blasted the flames away with a flick of a tail and began forming her own fire as several tails began spinning in a wheel-like motion, the fire arcing and snaking along them before they lashed forward as one, a massive tornado of white-hot fire, tearing its way across the village towards them and even as they dodged it. It twisted its way back around and began following them. The blonde flashed through hand seals at an insane pace before muttering a jutsu under his breath before dozens of water dragons materialized out of thin air, their liquid bodies flowing as they held their forms before launching themselves a roar at the firestorm, both colliding in a detonation of energy as they vanished in an explosion of steam which quickly dissipated into a blanket of fog and effectively hid both the toad boss and the Kyuubi from one another's sight. Kyuubi's sensitive hearing picked up the slight whisper of the blonde cage as he left the boss summons to stall her and she growled in disgust as he retreated, leaving her alone with a weak boss that she could just as easily kill as defeat. Where was her challenge? Where was the excitement? Where was her opponent? She took out her anger at being run out on by decimating the toad boss, entangling his body with her tails and tossing the boss aside and proceeded to toy with him for a time before piercing his brain with a tail and watched unamused as the elder boss vanished in a puff of smoke. She blinked as she felt the Hokage's chakra return and roared a challenge to him when he landed on her head, forming hand seals as he held a white bundle over his performing hands. And she watched in slight shock as she felt his life begin to drain away, as well as the appearance of a Shinigami lord before a force-strengthened hand touched her forehead. She gaped as a pair of deathly cold hands pried themselves down through her skull and then tore apart the chakra construct she used for her transformed body, her chakra billowing out as it vanished in a mist of red energy. Leonardo landed heavily on the ground as the demon's form disappeared beneath his feet, his right knee kneeled at the ground as he panted, sweat dripping from his face, and he gently cradled the small, bundled form of his son close to his chest. He felt the demon's soul pulse in his grip through the Shinigami, but he couldn't see what he really looked like but its misted form, as if the slight fog still around them kept his form from his sight. When the smoke cleared, he swallowed in slight fear as an outline of 9 tails waved lazily, calmly, in the air, while a tall form sat on its haunches. He expected an angry male in armor ready to give him death threats and swear bloody vengeance on his village. The form that greeted him left him stunned. Blood-red tresses curved down her back and pooled at her feet, several additional locks framing her face, neck, and generous chest. Her eyes were a similar shade, but swirled to a golden color occasionally, her pupils dilating slightly as the split pupils studied him closely, like one who studies a test subject, with an additional hidden glow of contempt and annoyance. Her eyes were thickened slightly with black, making the points of her eyes stand, while 3 thin black slash marks decorated each cheek, highlighted slightly with the sultry smirk she threw his way, a hint of her fangs peeking out. Pointed elf-like ears several inches in length poked out from her hair, the fuzzy fern encasing them the same shade as her hair. Her skin was darker than his own, a deep tan, nearly chocolate color, her outfit revealing a great deal of it. A thin black t-shirt was wrapped around her chest, but was small enough to expose her toned stomach, and a small jade stone pierced at her belly button. The shirt's shoulders had been cut off and left her shoulders bare, while her upper arms were wrapped with a pair of thin metal bands, while small capsules of varying colors lay evenly spaced along them, 10 for each band, 2 bands per arm. Around her neck lay a pair of large, white, and red wireless headphones, a small antenna sticking out from the left speaker. A sapphire tattoo of 9 flowing in a counterclockwise circle lay on her right shoulder, while the same tattoo lay on her left shoulder, but flowed in the opposite direction, and was a ruby color. In between both lay a symbol Minato had never seen, a small diamond with 4 small dots at each corner, and a small X set in the center, both symbols in ivory color. Along her forearms ran a set of silver greaves, the metal resembled a single long bar that had been twisted into a tight spiral along her arm, a pair of small double-edged knives sunk into sheaths along the inside of them, the hilt sticking out near the elbows. Around her wrist were a pair of thin, gray bracelets, while an inch-long end extended into the palm of her hands. Her hands remained bare, save around each of her fingers was a black ring with silver edges, a small rectangle-shaped ruby set in the center, while tiny alien symbols etched in gold ran the circumferences of the dark rings. Opened at the front and wrapped around her back was white, sleeveless jacket with 3 black metal clasps at both the upper and lower part of the jacket, decorated with small scrolls only a few inches in length, lined up in 2 rows at the bottom of the inner jacket. Around her waist lay a single black combat belt, equipment pouches lining the entire length, and a small silver rectangle a few inches in both length and width containing a black screen, one side entirely taken up with 4 rows of small, square buttons, each one containing a different green arcane symbol, attached to her left hip at the back. Flipped at both her right and left hip were a pair of long, black cylinders, each having a switch at the side and engraved with both gold and silver arcane symbols. Strapped at each of her upper thighs was a pair of black Beretta 92 FS pistols. At the back of her waist were strapped a pair of Walther P99 stainless handguns. Running down slightly past her knees were a pair of white, gray, and winter blue camouflage pants, rolled up to her upper calf, while a pair of black combat boots with slight armoring on the sides and back encased her feet, a pair of thin knives strapped to both sides of each boot. Smirking slightly at the human's stupefied face, she chuckled lightly to herself as her eyes swept over his form before drifting down towards the bundle in his arms, feeling the new but incredibly strong connection to the force, as well as the truly massive amount of inner energies flowing through his body. She debated internally about her new development before speaking with a smirk on her face. "You real of you've beaten me," she murmured in a sultry tone as she ascended to her feet before slowly making her way towards him, her boots crunching on the bare earth she scorched only minutes before. She felt an occasional tug at her soul as the Shinigami's ghostly arm stretched from a black spiral seal from Minato's stomach into her own, but she paid it little mind as she had a backup plan for this if anyone was crazy enough to do such a thing. She smirked at the look of terror and anger on his face before thrusting a clawed digit through the shocked man's throat before drawing it up through his mouth and then his skull and watched with a small amount of humor as he first started in horror and then shock as the hand ghosted through him, wavering as it moved, and yet he still felt a soft phantom touch from it. It was her laughter that jerked him from his shocked state of mind and brought it back to reality even as she kneeled to her thighs in front of him. "Stupid Terran. TCH, you really are an idiot. What you see before you is simply the astral projection of my soul, which I have taken my true form for. My energy is what allowed me to transform into the monstrous form before, and with you splitting my connection to my body, I can no longer touch you, let alone fight against you. Pity though, I would have Levedto have killed you. She grinned at the comment, but winced as the arms piercing her stomach pulsed, before continuing. I must applaud you for attempting such an insane idea, but such a thing won't defeat me, horse of your village. What? What are you talking about, Kyuubi no Kitsune? I have ripped your soul from your body and will soon seal you away into your death. The blonde exclaimed angrily in shock, but the vixen simply smiled mysteriously. Simple idiot. Sealing just defeating. The child you have with you may soon be my prison, but Nopperson is inescapable. Minato paled as she continued and simply grew wider and wider with more of her words before he smirked himself. The seal is based on the container's mental state. So long as he wishes you sealed, you'll have no power and you will stay imprisoned. Perhaps. And what if he doesn't, nah? What if I, and there was that damn seductive quality of her voice back with a vengeance, convinced him to let me go. The fourth Hokage of Konohagakure felt himself go white before he began to shiver in horror as his fear of the demon in front of him increased tenfold before she continued with that same damn smirk and tone as before. I can sense from you that you believe you're my, how interesting who you've chosen as my vessel, your son. Hahaha. Choosing your village over that of your own flesh and blood ha. And people call me a monster. You think your son will be thought of as a hero and be treated with respect? I think not. I have seen such situations, such as sealing, happen in the past, and the situation is nearly the same. You humans hate and despise what you cannot understand. Your son will be my vessel, a reminder of the description and death I caused them. They will ignore him, isolate him. They'll torment him both physically and mentally in order to do the same to me. However, from what you've done with the seal, you're going to bury me so far into his body that I'll have no access to him unless he comes to me himself. And because of such, I'll feel nothing, even if I could. But only the truly insane would try and kill him. And that would be what saves his life, because I am unsure if the extended healing abilities that I'll be able to transfer to him. This seal may be complicated, but give me a decade or so, and I'll crack it. But I don't need to. Eventually, the pain will overwhelm his fragile little mind, and the boy will be sent to me. As much as he will be mine, my vessel, and my jailer, I will be his prisoner, and his guardian. I will teach him. I will listen to his problems. I will be there to comfort him and to brush away the tears and pain. I will be there to hold him for comfort and to protect him. I will be his protector, his friend, his teacher, his sister, and his mother. I shall be there for his every need and want, and when I ask for my release, he will gladly give it to me. And he'll do it with a smile. She smiled, a light mischievous look on her face, before it twisted into a grimace of pain, and the ghostly arms gave a tug at her stomach, though the smile returned slightly, as the blonde across from her winced, as well as his chakra dropped to dangerous levels. Seems he had little time left. So she continued along, though her speech faltered occasionally, as her body spasmed. I'll be free, and there will be no one to stop me, as I level this village with him by my side, she growled. He even, as her body started to slowly dissolve into red dust, starting at her feet, then floating towards the bundled child at the Yondame's feet, before being absorbed into the child's body. DCH, what's with the shocked face, Ninjin? Did you think that I was going to kill him? I've been looking for an apprentice for a long time now, but I've yet to meet someone, she gasped in pain, as the dissolving reached her waist, who will meet my requirements. I have the perfect student right here. I'll raise him in my beliefs, and he will be everything I have ever wanted. I hope you will watch his growth from the afterlife, Terran, and feel free to hear the screams of your precious village inhabitants, as me and my apprentice send them on their way once I'm free. Even as the rest of her began to turn to dust and flow towards the glowing child, a seductive, musical, and above all vicious law erupted from her, continuing on up until she completely dissolved, the sound echoing around him and burning itself not Minato's soul. It was a laugh of triumph and eventually returned. He knew now that he hadn't won, but simply prevented the unenviable. And he could do no more than watch as his son's cloth bundle burned and became ash from the influx of demonic energy, the boy's pale, naked form darkening until he was a gold tan, and the previously glowing blood-painted seal he had endowed onto his son, minutes before darkening into a charcoal black, hissing and smoking as it finished its job, before the young father could only watch in shock. As more changes affected his newborn child, far more than he had ever expected from the sealing. His son's cheek split open in 3 slits before healing over and forming thin, black whisker-like scars. The tips of his small fingers split open before small claws erupted from them and fused with his fingernails. His ears cracked and lengthened into point, elf-like ears, each only 3 inches long, before they sprouted in short blonde fuzz, the same color as the small tuft of blonde hair framing his forehead. A bloody tearing sound, along with several cracks, reverberated from behind the child's back before a small fuzzy tail 2 feet in length curled its way around the child's body, bits of blood spattering the gold fur. The child's eyes began to bleed as he whimpered slightly, the blood running like fresh tears as the outlines thickened and adjusted slightly, giving him a more kitsune-ish look. Minato simply cried helplessly as his strength faded as he stared as his son's eyes opened for the first time, half-open bloody crimson meeting his own icy blue, black slits dilating in sleepiness before they lightened and a deep cerulean bleed through to replace the crimson, the slits re-aiming before the eyes closed and the child began to cry. His son's voice was the last thing the Yondaime heard as he toppled backwards, a horrified look on his face as to what the monster had done to his son and what, in time, he would do to the village he sacrificed the both of them for. Within minutes of the fog clearing from their battle, several Anbu squads discovered the body of their cage and knelt in reverence. One of them with long purple hair and a white and blue cat mask knelt and took up the child into her arms as the lithe figure and curves could only belong to a woman, stripped of her cloak and wrapped the crying child in it before slowly rocking him back and forth, cooing as she tried to soothe the child, succeeding within minutes as he'd fallen back to sleep. She smiled gently behind her mask as the baby cuddled closer to her armor, an unconscious reaction to the warmth and protection she offered. The rest of them created a litter before balancing their deceased leader on it and then sped off to report their victory and the cost it took to achieve it. On Hagakure Hospital. To say Kushina Namikaze was pissed would be an understatement. She'd just undergone nearly 12 hours of labor while dealing with idiotic doctors and her bastard husband who did this to her and took a vindictive pleasure in crushing his hand while she gave birth. The bastard had only made it back minutes before their son had been born. And then, after only seeing her son once, being able to hold him for only a few minutes, and giving him his first meal, her stupid idiotic fucking numbskull husband had taken their son with him to go and fight fucking Kyuubi for a second time. So she was stuck all alone to rest after the labor when the prick had put her to sleep with a genjutsu. A goddamn motherfucking genjutsu. Where in hell was his fucking pride, as a parent? Their child was a hell of a lot more important than some rampaging demon. And just what the hell did he need their son for? He didn't need to be on the battlefield. And no matter how much she threatened or screamed at Sarutobi or Jiraiya, neither of the pricks would tell her anything except stay tight-lipped and look sorrowful. What in the seven hells was going on? Hell, she scared the staff into conniptions when she nearly gotten out of bed and pulled a white-haired pervert to her and began to strangle him so she could get her answer until he was blue in the face until Tsunade and several other female medical shinobi had pried her off him and gently urged her back to bed, telling her that she was still weak and that overtaxing herself and burning precious energy in her condition could kill her. She'd immediately gotten back to bed and then rested but continued to glare at the two old bastards as she waited for them, but she wasn't about to accidentally kill herself when her son and husband would be back soon. So she had sat and simply simmered in her anger before grinning as she turned towards her mentor and second mother of sorts. Sweetly asking if she the older blonde could get her answers for her, Tsunade grinned as she cracked her knuckles and dragged the white-haired pervert outside and Kushina smiled happily as his screams ringed into her ears. And she cuddled slightly under her blankets in glee before the smile dimmed slightly as he missed the small wider of her son that showed right next to her. Fucking Minato. You better have a damn good reason for taking our son or I'll skin you alive after I get out of here, she threatened under her breath before folding her arms and waited. She had little time to, as within minutes later, Tsunade had returned, but the look on her face had Kushina immediately worried. Whatever the hell it wasn't good. The last time she'd seen such tears was when her fiancé Dan had died. The story the blonde recapped to her had her blood turn to ice and tears fell down her face at what was to happen to her son if it hadn't happened at all, and by her husband, no less. Hours before the demon's chakra had dimmed, but it was still strong. She fell into a restless sleep for several hours as Tsunade put her to sleep to calm the distraught mother, and upon awakening, she was told of her husband's death and sacrifice for the village. She ignored the pitying looks and thanks for her husband's sacrifice and demanded her son. When her attendees, the doctors, Tsunade and a platoon of Anbu, accessed her room, she let out a sigh of relief when one of them carried the small form of her child wrapped up in a dark cloak before holding out her trembling arms to receive her son. It was only when he was close to her heart and she got a second good look at him that she noticed the changes. She scanned over the changes with a look of disbelief before they hardened in hate, and the assembled shinobi stepped back as killing intent poured from her body, skyrocketing in rage as she screamed out the name of the one who had done this to their, no, person. Minato, you bastard. Her voice carried itself across the village, and civilians and shinobi alike shivered at the hatred and sorrow it carried. Even as the killing intent and rage died away, Tsunade felt herself relax at the look of love, adoration, and relief that graced the red-haired woman's face at having her child safely and securely cradled in her arms. She felt her son shift and began to cry, and even as she nursed him, she carefully looked over the changes that had occurred to her son. Fuzzy blonde hair tipped his head and had a texture similar to her own locks, and he possessed the deepest blue eyes she had ever seen, while the cat-like slits gave him an exotic dangerous look, the blue a shade darker than even his fath. Minato-sans, she corrected, as she could never forgive him for what he had done to her son, no matter the cost. As far as she was concerned, the village mattered little to that of her family. Minato should have simply taken the demon with him and died, not sealed it into her son and left him with such a burden. His face bore great resemblance to the passed-away Cage, but several of her own, softer features were mixed into it and, as far as she was concerned, his looks were mostly from her. The three thin, black scar-like marks on each cheek made him even cuter in her opinion, and she wouldn't be surprised that, as he would grow older, they stop being cute and develop a more exotic feral trait to them. The fuzzy elf-like ears were soft and warm to the touch, and she noticed he relaxed a great deal as she ran her fingers along them, and they twitched occasionally. What made him completely and absolutely adorable was the small bushy 2-foot-long foxtail that swished and curled around his body, the fur the same color as his hair, and she noticed, with both glee and dread, that he purred when it was stroked. This could be a problem in the future. Especially if he had touchy girlfriends. The small claws that tipped his pudgy fingers were amazingly sharp, she noticed, innocently shredding anything he got his hands on, her hospital gown an example, as he easily ripped apart the cloth in a grip far stronger than a normal child, and she also noticed, with a wince, he had fangs. Very sharp pointy fangs that were currently puncturing into her breast as he fed. She thought about what he may look like in the future if he looked anything like Minato-san, and after wiping the blush-inducing image but filing it away for future reference, immediately began planning to keep him away from the major clans, but most especially the Inyazuka, Hyuga, and Uchiha clans. The clans loved power, strength, and anything that made them different, such as exotic traits or unique abilities, and while they may try to keep their bloodlines pure, they would also do just about anything to give themselves an edge. The Hyuga and Inyazuka both absolutely exotic traits. The Hyuga would come for her child's ability to harbor the demon's chakra, and while the Inyazuka would do the same, they would be just as interested in his animal-like traits, as well as the massive chakra reserve she could feel him already producing. The Uchiha would want him for the reserves, as well as getting such abilities into a clan that constantly drained chakra with a Dojutsu and used it on precious fire techniques, could use an added edge. She knew that his reserves would be enormous because of both herself and Minato-san, but that was Bepharod's stupid demonic furball wasted to it. He wasn't even a few hours old, and his chakra stores were over that of a Chunin, and still growing. If it was the Kitsune doing such, she needed to find out how high the power would grow before she could begin training him, or he would never be able to have the control she had painstakingly acquired over years of trial and error. Hell, her reserves were even bigger than Minato-san's, but she had only up to simple medic nin control over it, unlike the dead blonde who could control his like he was born to. Another unfair thing that her child may have inherited from the bastard. However, she could ponder such things later, as worrying about it now would give her nothing but a headache. And her son was far more important for her time to be used on. Several days later. The village remained quiet with mourning, as its inhabitants prayed for the departed soul of their beloved Kage. Genin to Anbu, children to elderly. All showed up for this day to give their thanks. All showed to remember the sacrifice their leader had given to exterminate the demon that had destroyed much of their village and killed thousands. However, each and every one of them remembered a kind word or two for the recently widowed Kushina Namikaze, now Uzumaki. For some reason she had changed her name back to her original, and while she held both clan seats in the council now, she made sure everyone called her by her maiden name. And her son was another curiosity. He was bundled up and always within arm's distance of herself. The only part of himself seen in public was a small tuft of blonde hair, and she was extremely protective of him, actually breaking the arm of a poor Chunin that had jokingly tried to take him from her. She'd beaten him black and blue after it as well, before partially collapsing from expanding so much energy soon after her birthing. She was still in poor condition, the birthing hard on her body, but could at least move around for several hours holding her son before needing rest. None of them questioned the presence of several platoons of Anbu that currently guarded her, as they knew that both her and her son would be future targets from enemy shinobi, with their connection to the Yondaime. Starting safety procedures sooner than later would lengthen their lifespans. Even as she sat herself near Sarutobi after his reinstatement as Kage, her face remained flat and wary, as while he may have stayed jovial, she simmered underneath her mask at Jiraiya's abandonment. The bastard was nowhere to be found. The moment Minato-san had died and he'd been informed of the sealing, he'd made copies of the notes and records about the seal before taking off, stating that he would return when he better understood them. Kushina explained to him that he didn't have to leave and was perfectly fine learning about the seals while staying in the village and helping to look after her son. The bastard left anyway. She drifted her thoughts back from the deserter to Sarutobi's words as he recounted Kyuubi's rampage and the sacrifices it took to defeat it before dropping the bombshell on them and telling them it was sealed, not killed. He motioned towards her, and while she held her child gently against her, as she carefully stood up, several of the Anbu behind her tensed as their gazes turned towards her son before slowly creeping their ways up towards their swords. He nodded to her, and she left the cloth covering her child, revealing the several new changes to his body, his ears, cheek marks, claws, and foxtail visible while the rest remained covered. Sarutobi declared that her son had the Kyuubi sealed inside of him by Minato and was to be hailed as a hero for keeping the demon contained. Kushina grew concerned over the stunned silence that held the crowd before all hell broke loose. The civilians began howling for his blood, shinobi took up arms against one another, one side targeting her son, while the other raged against the other, as it was their duty. Sarutobi shouted orders to have her seen to safety even as he took off to take out a large group that was launching large amounts of dragon-type jutsu that were causing too much havoc. She could scarcely make out his parting words over the roar of the crowd and the noise of unleashed jutsu and pained screams as an all-out civil war erupted only feet away from her. It wasn't until she heard the distinct clash of steel on steel that she looked towards her own Anbu guards and was appalled to already find several of them downed, their blood stained on the blades of former comrades. Her only current protection at the moment was a cat-masked purple-haired Anbu dual wielding a pair of swords, but the woman was fading fast. She was continuously outnumbered by several shinobi at once on until she finally dropped, too tired and wounded to move, her uniform and armor shredded and stained with both her blood and that of over a dozen bodies surrounded her, and even then, she struggled to her feet, only to be dropped by a backhand to the face from the brat Kakashi. While Minato had taken the kid in, as a student, he hadn't been completely successful in driving out the brat's arrogance and self-belief superiority to others. Even after the brat's teammate had killed himself to save him and think of him a transplanted to jutsu, his arrogance had only grown instead of shrinking, as Minato had hoped such a regrettable experience would his teammate, Rin, had been so disgusted with his behavior that she had left the team and begun training under herself before she sent the girl off to the hospital to act as a medic nin. She glared at him as she cradled her child to her chest with her left arm, feeling the silver-haired bastard's mismatched eyes boring holes into her child, his Dijutsu's three black swirling slowly around a sea of red. Give us the demon, Kushina-sama. He killed Minato-sensei, and he'll only escape and kill the rest of us if we don't end his life here, right now. You can't have my son, Kakashi. Minato sealed, you idiot. You understand the word sealed, that means it's trapped. The monster can't do a thing to us now. He's no more than a container for the monster, so leave him alone. She screamed back at him, incensed by the thought of her son being killed right in front of her, and while she was still weak, she could still defend herself. You fail to see reason and are delusional. That is not your son, but the Kyuubi using his body as its vessel. It's using you to defend itself because it's so weak right now. Take the demon from her, but don't harm her. She's simply being used by the monster, so we'll kill it now and end its life now, since Minato-sensei couldn't. The teen spoke lightly before his eyes hardened and he nodded at the shinobi encircling her. One leapt at her side and tried to snatch her son, but she spun on her left heel around and slammed the heel of her right foot into the side of his skull, followed up by a right backhanded fist to the face for good measure, the shinobi's Anbu mask cracking, and the man went flying, tumbling several times before stopping. He didn't get up. She spun a pair of kunai out from her pouch and placed one in her mouth, the blade pointed to her right, while twirling to another into a reversed position, the thumb ring held over her thumb, before she held it in front of herself in a defensive stance, her knees bent slightly. Another two jumped at her front and back at the same time, even as she danced again before dipping backwards and spinning, the blade in her mouth opening up the man's stomach, and she buried the other into his side, quickly replacing the missing one from her hand with the one from her mouth, and then slamming it up into the throat of the one in front of her, before tearing it upwards. And then outwards with a jerk, blood splashing her face, as the man clutched at his mutilated throat, as he gurgled while blood poured from his mouth and neck, before toppling backwards, as more shinobi leapt at her. Damn it, Sarutobi, where the fuck are you? I can't hold them off forever by myself with my current weak state. Hurry, please. She gritted her teeth at the thought before her hand unoccupied from her child, blurring into one-handed seals. She killed several more before they managed to catch up with her speed, her chakra still dangerously low from her birth and from being burned up to help, as a crutch for her current weakness. They bound her arms behind her and dragged her struggling body away from her now crying child, even as Kakashi took him up and then placed him in a circle that had parted from the crowd, cheering and howling for his blood. Kakashi drew his sword before flipping it to point downwards. She felt only slight relief when Sarutobi and several of her few remaining friends started battling their way through shinobi and civilians alike, desperately killing their way to reach her son. Sarutobi's summon worked their way through them, Tsunade was crushing skulls and pelting anyone who got in her way clear across the block with her monster strength, some of the Uchiha and Hyuga unleashing fire and organ crippling strikes respectively, the Inyazuka dogs tearing away at comrades, while the Ino-Shikacho combination families took over mines. Overpowered them with enlarged bodies, or the shadow users held them in place to die, while even medic nins led by Shizune were using their previous gifts, life-saving, as deadly weapons, chakra scalpels dancing, and severing tendons, muscle, and inner organs. But it wasn't enough. Kakashi had already raised his sword and the crowd around him chanted for death and roared their approval before he dropped to his knees and thrust the point down towards her son's heart. She could do no more than scream out her fear, loss, and rage, the emotion swirling with the name of her son as the blade pierced his heart. Naruto. Before stopping in shock and horror as the Jonin and the crowd themselves were blown away by a vortex of blood-red chakra, and miasma of hatred, rage, power, and death itself exploded from his body. Kakashi felt his heart palpitate and nearly stop as the child's eyes snapped open, the crystalline blue bleeding into hateful crimson. He froze as waves of chakra and an aura of death washed over him, and the crowd quieted behind him as they too froze, shivering in terror. He started to panic as a quiet seductive whisper, dripping lust, passion, and a tinge of excitement boomed in his mind, but he also noticed that as those around him could hear it as well, considering many of them had gone a far paler shade of white than was possible, and many had began to gibber in terror. Foolish, trying to kill a child because you think he's me? Trying to kill a child in order to end MILF? How pathetic, you will be one of the first to dye silver hair in the coming years. You really thought it would be so Asido kill me, Fikayubi no Kitsune that stories, folklore, and legends speak of. Even in such a state as your Belavikij has forced me. Foo, I'll enjoy tearing you to shreds when I get out of this seal. Pray for your pathetic existence, mortal, and live in terror for the rest of your life, short as it will be. The day I shall reap my vengeance will be sooner than you think, and my dear, beloved apprentice shall be the one to help me. Now, from my sight, the worm had hissed. The voice vanished from his mind and he felt himself relax, but it was short-lived before the energy pouring from the child in front of him raced its way through those standing close to the boy, the bubbling chakra entering and engulfing their bodies. Agony unlike anything Kakashi had ever felt coursed its way through his body, the molten chakra burning its way through his inner body and organs, and to his horror, he felt his connection to his chakra beginning to fade. From the burning pain his chakra points were giving off, it seemed as if the demon's chakra was literally devouring his chakra points from the legs up, its presence and power growing in his body as his own chakra decreased. He screamed as his skin began to melt and catch fire and his uniform dissolved as the chakra poured from his skin as it split open, rivulets of blood running from the scarred and burned skin. His back arched as his bones became electrified and to his horror, he began to expand. Around him dozens of villagers and even a few shinobi began to do the same, each of them reaching a plump size, making them look like human balloons. With his Sharingan recording it, Kakashi started, horrified, as they reached a certain size and then began to explode like bombs as the chakra ripped their bodies apart, showering the crowd with blood, organs, and other assorted gore. He reached his own body's climax and the man screamed as his body was obliterated into nothing more than hunks of meat and blood as the fox's chakra did its deadly work. Anyone else that was beyond several meters from the child remained alive, though much of the victim's skin was partially melted away and their hair burned clean off, and those even farther away were simply tossed away from the force exuded from the chakra blast. Kushina watched all of it with slight fear, awe, and mostly deep-seated concern for her child, as the demon's chakra encased her son and killed his attackers, and from the looks of the ways they died, it was truly as potent as legends dictated, and in this case, mortally toxic to anyone other than her son who came in contact with it. Her own captors froze behind her as the monster's killing intent increased and swept over them, and it was only her concern for her son that helped her fight it. She broke herself free from their grip and quickly slammed a pair of kunai back into their throats before carefully trudging her way towards her son, her arms covering her face as the heat, wind, and killing intent it produced slammed against her, stalling her slightly before she pushed on towards her son and kneeling in order to pick him up. Tears still ran from her frightened child's face, but his cries died down after she held him to herself. Her own scared face faded as she found no wound or even scar from where Kakashi had tried to kill him, and her face lit up in a smile as the small blonde burrowed closer into her chest. Curious, blood-red eyes gazed up into her own crimson sight before the demons receded and slithered back into his body, and the deep blue she'd come to love returned. She smiled gently down at her child as she absently hummed a tune to him, and the child quieted as his eyes began to flutter and he gave a small, sleepy yawn before curling closer as he began to drift asleep. Much as she hated to admit it, she silently gave thanks to the monstrous fox laying somewhat dormant inside her son's body for protecting her child. However, the soothing, musical, and seductive voice that answered her silent thanks was unexpected, and she felt herself pale as she froze in place. No thanks are necessary, child. If your son dies before I escape this prison, so shall I, and I'm not about to be killed so easily, and I absolutely refuse to be this pathetic village's hands. However, it will be most interesting to see what your son will become in the future with a village that harbors such animosity for him. Raise him well, Kushina Uzumaki. I wouldn't want my apprentice to be a fear-filled child. Make him powerful, and don't you dare die. I don't want to have to raise my apprentice myself if you would be stupid enough to get yourself killed. He will be as precious to me as he is to you, and I'll keep him alive any way I can. You should feel grateful as well, child, considering the much of the training you Tyrannis to have is millennia old and will be passed down to your son, as well as many skills that I myself have mastered even a long time ago. And the majority of them are some of the deadliest styles, arts, and techniques in galactic history. Rest assured, when I'm done with his training, he will be unstoppable. Good luck, mother of my beloved apprentice. The seductive and most definitely female voice trailed away from her mind, and she felt something, almost like a slight pressure, leave her mind with the voice. She felt her knees give out and fell back onto her butt as a shocked look gracing her face as she stared blankly forward, beginning to process the message the fox, or vixen in this case, had given her. She continued in her stupor as the Sandame and the others made their way towards her. She jumped slightly as the elderly man coughed and set her sights on the few friends she seemed to have left in the village. The man's armored form was covered in blood, and so was Tsunade. Beside her stood Shizune, her arms caked in blood, but little of it stained her outfit, and a few squads of medical ninja behind her ran quickly from person to person, their hands glowing with green healing chakra. Kushina felt herself sigh in relief as Yuugo began to limp her way towards her, holding her bleeding left arm while still clutching her sword, and a haggard but smiling face grinning at her. Motoko and several of her clan members approached, their armor and sword stained with blood, while Motoko's equipment was nearly pristine, save her blade that was dyed red with blood. She was highly relieved to see her alright. Sumin Yuzuka walked with a limp, and her canine partner trudged alongside her, his fur matted with blood, both his enemies and some of his own. Kushina blinked in shock as the image of a dozen Hyuga and Hiashi himself watching the crowd around them, their Byakugans activated and scanning everyone, while his brother Hisashi stood beside him. The Nara, Yamanaka, and Akimichi clan's head were present along with several members of their families, and while they stood watch, many of them gazed back at her son in fear and apprehension, but at least they tolerated and didn't come after her child. Light Ogai, bless the man, had also shown, and despite the blood covering his spandex and the frown on his face, he held a bright look in his eye towards that of her son. Over her right shoulder stood the head of the I and T division, Marino Ibiki, as well as a pair of young Chunin, Anko Mitarashi, and Kurenai Yuhi. Kurenai was fast becoming one of Konoha's premier Jinjutsu experts, but was also branching out into assassination skills, as she didn't want to rely on just one shinobi art. After all, who in their right mind would only specialize in illusions and then let their other skills degrade and never improve? Anko was also advancing quickly through the ranks, excelling in ninjutsu and assassination techniques, as well as being the only one in the village to hold the snake summoning contract after her mentor Orochimaru betrayed the village for his own ends after being found out using the residents and many shinobi as test subjects for his experiments. However, the poor girl had been ignored and ostracized because of having him as a sensei, as well as harboring a curse seal mark that he had experimented with. While the council, mostly the civilians, had been in an uproar and wanted her confined as a security risk, they were quickly stamped out by the Sandame, and she was allowed continued service as a shinobi, as well as any incidents against her when she was a genin being heavily dealt with by the Sandame, leaving her in some peace, though it was an isolated one. Both of them were orphans, Anko having been found outside of Konoha by Orochimaru when she was only a few years old, and Kurenai's family had all died when she was very young, but she was able to live on her own comfortably because of the modest reserves the clan had built up before they died off and left her alone. Kushina observed the two carefully before slowly getting to her feet and making her way towards the two of them, her son rocking slightly in her arms. She didn't want him to have only herself as one who cared for him, and the two of them, if the idea quickly growing in her mind had merit, would make great friends to her son, as well as idols to look up to. And with their own situations of isolation, they should be able to help each other cope with it. She was looking forward to the days to come. 5 years later, Uzumaki compound. An irate frizzy-haired Kushina woke with a loud yawn as her alarm went off, and she groped blindly with half-open eyes for the switch, creating several dents in her already damaged dresser before they smashed down on the clock, slipping off it and towards the edge of her bed. Blurry eyes blinked sleepily as her arms came over her head and her shoulders cracked as she stretched. And her neck crooked several times as she moved it side to side before her arms came to rest on her lap. She sighed lightly before clearer eyes turned towards her son. He'd grow well these several years, becoming slightly taller than those around his age. His ears and tail had lengthened from the puffy balls of fuzz they used to be, while the rest of his features remained the same, his canines lengthening and adding a smaller additional pair underneath from his lower jaw after the rest of his teeth had come in. His teething phase had been absolute hell on the furniture and anything he got his fangs into. Much of his baby fat was gone from his body, and while he remained cute, there was a small hint of maturity to his form now. Slight muscle ran the course of his body, and while giving him a flat stomach and defined chest, arms, and legs, her son had better, softer skin than she did. And it was only her knowledge that while the Kyuubi Sameto be unable to communicate with her son, it was steadily and quietly improving his body into a state that would be to his advantage for the future. While she wanted her child to defend himself and perhaps become a shinobi himself, she was going to wait a few more years before actually starting him on anything other than the small meditation exercises, which to her astonishment the boy took to it like a prodigy, considering he was such a bundle of energy, and the small physical exercises that he did every day with her. As a morning routine to get him used to it and also to help stretch and get himself motivated in the mornings. Her son took after her in much of his personality, as the both of them weren't morning people. However, her smile dimmed slightly as her son burrowed closer to her, his tail curled around his body and his body hunched into a ball, looking not unlike a sleeping cat. Or fox in this case. She grumbled to herself. Her son rarely slept in his own room, opting to sleep with her or with the others because of the nightmares he had during the night. His dreams all started out as nightmares, and from what he had described them to her, they were disturbing. Massive armies lost in rays of light, ships that flew destroyed by those same lights. A woman with red hair and eyes swinging two beams of light that cut down all who stood in her path, while another nightmare showed her tearing apart an entire army of steel-clad samurai with her bare hands, their blood staining her body and laughing face. She didn't know what they meant, but it seemed that he may be unconsciously watching the memories of the one inside of himself, though what the kitsune could be dreaming about scared her. However, she was at least happy that his nightmares never resulted from the actions of the village against her son. Much as she hated it, she couldn't always be with her son, as she was still a shinobi of the village, after being called back into service after the Kyuubi's rampage had decimated over 85% of their forces. She hated it and had initially refused, but had been pressured into it with a deal by the Sandaime for her services, and it was only the increased benefits it gave her child that she accepted in the first place. They lost several dozen more after the riots broke out over the truth of her son, and afterwards her son was kept under security surveillance by a platoon of Anbu loyal to her and the Hokage. His first several years were the easiest on them, as the house was kept under watch and she could stay home to watch her son. However, after he grew older and she was capable of leaving him on his own, with some of her missions taking weeks at a time, she'd had to have someone other than the Anbu to watch and care for her son. His Ni-chans helped out tremendously, but they too were shinobi, and, as such were also stuck with missions, and though they did their best to regulate the time they all had to be gone and leave at least one of themselves with him, there were times when he was alone by himself, but at least with the Anbu they were watching from the shadows. However, she always took the time to have the house stocked with food, as her son's appetite was insane, and having a nearly bottomless pit, especially when it came to some of his favorite foods, was a nightmare. She attributed his metabolism to that of the fox, making additional changes to her son. And said changes were starting to piss her off. The damn thing was changing her son to its own purposes and advantage, and she had little idea why it did so, save that it wanted him as an apprentice. But why? Why the sudden interest in her son, considering it was the demon's prison? Just what in hell was the thing up to? What was it planning to do after it had trained him? It had killed her husband, but the death had let her see just what kind of person Hiri was when the decisions came down to it. His village was more important than his own family. Much as she knew the Hokage was sworn to defend it by any means necessary, from the notes she had found dealing with seals and the notes he'd left, he could have easily taken the fox with him when he died. But instead, she cursed her son with a monster, and she was finding it harder and harder each day to find out the real reason she had wanted to be with him. It was that single decision of his that gave her such anger towards him now. If he had survived the sealing, she and her son would have been long gone. If they didn't have a child, who would he have used? Another family? Would he have used it on himself? Or would he have used someone else? She didn't know, but the question still gave her shivers. However, her thoughts drifted back towards a happier note as she remembered that she had the week off as a vacation and her son's birthday was coming up at the end of it. And he was going to have a nice peaceful birthday, and she wasn't about to let anything ruin it. Especially at those bastard villagers and their stupid festival. Naruto-kun, it's time to get up. She gently urged her son, a hand placed at the small of his back as she shook him lightly, but all that he did was he groaned and curled himself tighter into a ball as he burrowed into her side. She sighed at him with a mischievous smile on her lips as she shook him again, but tugged lightly on his tail with her other hand as an incentive. The boy shivered from head to toe as his back arched and started to move around with a groan before sliding to his knees and rubbing the sleep from his eyes with a fist, a cute fanged yawn drifting from him as his ears drooped while his tail uncurled itself from around his waist and began to wave and dance behind him. The boy blinked at her, before yawning, as he drew his small arms around her neck and tentative touched his nose to her neck, his cheek resting against her neck as he felt her pulse and inhaled her scent, before rubbing his cheek to hers with a smile and gently fighting his way out of the large covers and falling over the side of the bed, his impact a small thump on the floorboards. Kushina laughed as his head popped up from over the end of it, his ears twitching as they swiveled towards her voice, before he stumbled to his feet as he waved lightly to her, before dropping to his hands and setting his feet behind him, and he began doing push-ups, his small quiet voice counting them off as she watched. She nodded to him as he looked to her after every few sets for guidance, before she herself left the bed and placed herself beside him and began her own reps, her larger form going faster than his, but a smile on her face as she watched him stop and cross his legs underneath himself and begin watching her. She was into the several hundreds before stopping and smiled lightly as her son sat himself over her back, his legs dangling over her left side, and she switched so only her right hand's pointer finger was set into the floor and begin her one finger push-ups with added weight, her smile growing as her son giggled over top herself as her muscles moved and contorted below his legs. As they swung slightly 2 and 4. She stopped after doubling the amount she used with two-handed push-ups, using each of her fingers on both hands, before rolling over and laying on her back as her hands went behind her neck, her son copying her on her other side. They completed their reps before her child sat himself over her stomach and she repeated it once again. Her son smiled at her as he got off before the both of them began to stretch, going for their arms first, the shoulder sockets cracking lightly as they rolled them before sitting down and beginning to stretch their legs, several satisfying. Kushina got to her feet first and embraced her son before he kissed her lightly on the cheek and ambled his way towards the door, a white oversized t-shirt clinging over his upper half and a pair of black shorts covering his legs. Always the same thing in the morning. She woke him up, he clung to her and inhaled her scent, then fell off the bed. They completed their morning exercises and then he trailed downstairs for breakfast after going and waking his Ni-chans. Laughing lightly at the sounds of an alarm screeching awake, a woman screaming at the one responsible to shut the fucking thing up, and a shower beginning to run, Kushina simply got to her feet and paraded herself downstairs towards to their first floor and snaked her way through the living room and into her kitchen. Several minutes after she was well into her way of preparing breakfast, she was greeted with a quiet good morning, Ka-san. From her son. She hummed her own quiet greeting to him as he trudged over towards his bar stool seat at their countertop that he used as a table, his hair and fur still damp from his shower. She giggled to herself as the small blonde took a black brush to his tail as he held the extra appendage over his lap and started to untangle the knots that had gotten into it. It was one of the few things that irritated her son about his unique body, but was also an activity that he found oddly calming. Hearing grumbling along with several curses, Kushina raised an eyebrow as Anko Mitarashi made her way downstairs, dressed in little more than a purple t-shirt and matching panties, with Kurenai Yuhi following close behind her in a black and red lingerie. Both were tired, but Anko was a better morning person, using an alarm to keep her schedule, otherwise she'd simply sleep in, even with her swearing. Kurenai was an absolute monster when woken, a testament to her screaming from before. Both muttered low, but chipper mornings towards herself, before sitting on either side of her son. Anko muttered to a morning kid. As she missed the blonde hair which he glowered at her for, as he would have to rebrush his hair again, but calmed and smiled as she took the brush from him and initiated her own treatment with his tail. Kurenai had calmed after the smell of breakfast, to her stomach's delight, and wrapped her arms around the small blonde as she gave a friendly good morning as she produced another comb and started on his hair. She watched as his son rested comfortably against the young woman's sizable assets as she started on his hair, the boy's eyes and ears drooped as he became a pile of goo as she combed his tangled locks into some semblance of order, much of it held at the base of his neck. Both of the young women found the daily activity they had tasked themselves with as relaxing and refreshing, and her son simply basked in the affections his sisters showered him with. They lived with the two of them for a few days after he was born, and they had immediately taken to her child like their own little brother, much to her delight. Kushina dropped her musings as she finished breakfast, placing plates of grilled fish, steam-wafting rice, and freshly cut fruit for them, before she sat herself in front of her son and started her own meal, chopsticks in hand, as the other three devoured their plates. She watched their interactions as they conversed quietly to one another, but stopped as she cleared her throat and got their attention. Kurenai-chan, Anko-chan. She called, "Can I ask you for a favor?" The two older teens sat up and looked at her as they listened, and she took their attention as a yes. "I have a meeting with the old bastard today for a few things, and it will take some time before it's over. Could you watch Naruto-kun for me until I'm done?" Both women blinked at the request before nodding and going back to their food. Kushina took her plate and that of her sons to the sink before retreating to her room to get dressed. She came back downstairs as the others finished their meals, clad in a red zipped leather jacket with black curving lines and zigzags running down the back and around the arms, a green Jounin vest laying open over it, while black pants lined with pockets clung to her legs. She wore red combat boots instead of traditional shinobi sandals, and her hands were encased in black leather fingerless gloves with metal plates sewn into the back of the fist. A pair of kunai and shuriken pouches were strapped to both thighs, and a medic nin's combat belt was looped around her waist. Her headband had a black cloth band instead of the regular blue and was wrapped around her neck, while her hair was pulled into a high tight ponytail at the back of her head. Her left hand held a smooth black painted wooden sheath of an adachi, the end capped with a silver wolf's head, and 3 bands of unburnished silver at the upper portion of the sheath half an inch apart, starting 2 inches down from the case's head. Carved into each band around the sheath was a different kanji. The first, nearest to the hilt, was Itsuru, the next, Fuyuno, and the last, Okami. 1. The blade's sheath was wrapped in crimson leather and a helix spun grip, while the hilt's guard was designed into a pair of intersecting, opposing black steel spirals that started at the hilt and ended themselves as etchings into the sword blade. The hilt's end cape was also that of a silver wolf's head. She reached down and hugged her son with her free arm before disappearing in a spiral of water vapor. Naruto grinned as his mother left, his fangs glinting as he turned to his sisters, both of them seeing the look and sighed. They knew that look and visibly shuddered at what a day they were going to have. But at least it was going to be fun visiting those that he loved. The vacuum of space, several clicks above Terran colonized planet 1,149,387. The darkness of space was vast and silent while a large ship, sleek, slender, and bearing arcane symbols, made its way towards the planet below. Its engines fluctuated with bluish-white glowing propulsion before becoming silent, the ship's hull glowing slightly as it broke through the planet's atmosphere before it began to flicker, its hull shimmering as it gradually cloaked itself, becoming invisible to both the eye and most advanced tracking sensors and equipment, while several sleek pods descended ahead of it as it followed them. It had been nearly a century since they had last been to this planet, and the ship's crew members, its clan, grew excited. Their young, unblooded offspring would begin their blood rites of ascension. Those that passed a dangerous and highly fatal trial ahead would become adults in the eyes of their clan, and their standings within the clan would outshine those of any dozen normal hunts. If they survived, that is. They were yautja, hunters and warriors, the greatest this galaxy had ever known. Normally they stood anywhere from 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall. The shortest never reached 7 feet and had a yellow and greenish tint to their skin, while others may have had pelts bearing camo blotches or spots and stripes, all of them bearing some sort of scars over their bodies, gender notwithstanding. The female yautja were a bit smaller than their male equivalents, but were surprisingly beautiful hominoids in appearance and shared only the muscle mass, height, skin tone, claws, fangs, eyes, and dreadlocks of their species, as well as missing the claspers the males had. Of the yautja, the males were larger than the females and were some of the ugliest things ever conceived as life. 4 clasper-like tusks were scrunched around their mouths, 2 near the top and at the bottom of their mouths, and they had upper and lower fang-filled jaws. Their eyes were bright, burning yellow with cat-like slits for pupils, and only the rarest of them had either bright green and rarer still, blue eyes. Such traits were highly prized beside fighting, hunting, and physical abilities. Their fingers and toes were clawed, their bodies vaguely humanoid, save they were covered in bulging muscle and were much bigger than any normal Terran. Most of them wore grayish metallic body armor, covering their chests, legs, thighs, shoulders, and forearms, while skulls and bones of alien races decorated some, others carrying archaic Terran weapons, and those of other species, while their own blades and spears rested in palms or slung along their waist or backs. Also, every one of them had blades jutting from their wrist, but the lengths and designs differed from individual to individual, and the wrist from which they had them present were also different, with neither wrist being favored. Each had a metal face mask present, either anchored to their faces, held in their hands, or clasped to their sides. Their hair was chitinous, long-stranded and stalk-like, but braided into dreadlocks at the back of their skulls, others having some different styles with them, but most preferred the free-falling dreadlocks. They stood silently, but fidgeted in apprehension, while odd, clicking growls echoed in the room as a much larger member of their clan cleared his way through the room. His face was covered in old scars and battle wounds, as well as missing his upper right tusk and clasper, revealing the flesh and jaw near his mouth. His armor was thicker and more intricately decorated and designed than the others, while beads and necklaces surrounded his neck, as well as a dark cape clasped over the armor, a highly decorated spear held in his right hand. To an imprinted mark, a pair of sickle/marks around a small dot was burned into his forehead, the same mark located on his mask. 3. He growled at the other assembled around him in the same clicking growl language, before snapping his mask to his face and inserting a pair of tubes up into the side of it. The mask gave a hiss as it sealed itself with suction to his face, before turning in his stride and entering an open area with an airlock door over the floor and one shifting closed from where they came. Several oblong pods lay as they hummed with energy. The yautja young bloods, smaller in stature than their parents, tentatively followed him as their parents stayed behind and watched them leave and entered the room as doors opened on the sides. They entered the pods and fidgeted as they closed before drifting into a highly relaxed state as gas filtered into their enclosure and put them into a stasis sleep before they dropped through the floor after the room was depressurized and they were sent into space. They flew as a group before descending to the planet below as their ship followed behind them, their landing zone the outskirts of a primitive Terran village filled with forests. Below Kanahagakur's walls and attached to its solar systems, a massive generator restarted itself after a century of stasis and started the systems attached to it, most notably revitalizing and melting a frozen, black-colored nightmare rod of madness. The enraged screams of a monster from the blackest parts of space could be heard echoing through the tunnels. As she gave birth to her children, and her parasitic brood was then taken from her for another purpose other than her own. Anko smiled to herself as she and Kurenai sprinted after their charge, both setting a relatively slow pace for a jonin, as their blonde brother bounced around like a demented rabbit on steroids, his steps light on the tips of his feet as he continued to transverse the buildings, roofs, and back alleys of Konoha like his own personal jungle gym. They followed behind him as he continued to play, his feet crunching on concrete as he landed on a roof, only to launch himself with his arms wide apart and palms open before snagging a flagpole as he spun around it several times before curling his body closer to it and land with his feet to the side and hanging with one hand, his claws digging into the metal slightly. Before springing from it and hitting the side of a back alley, then rebounding off its side and back into the air, then landed with a heavy thud, his boots creating a small indent into the roof's wooden thatch before he bound off again, his laughter trailing after himself to his two sisters as they chased after him. The boy was in a hurry but was playful in his gait, and his joy was the result of not only spending the day with his sisters, but also due to the visiting of several others that day that were beloved in his heart. The closest one of said persons were traveling to the Uchiha district to visit Motoko Ni-sama. She lived the farthest away from them compared with the others, but Naruto loved visiting her, nearly considering her another sister, and when his own mother was away, an aunt. They finally caught up to the blonde about a block away from the compound, but after catching up and taking notice of his gaze, they immediately stopped. The blonde was crouched over his legs, balancing lightly on his heels as he stared down at the district's front gates, ears twitching before laying flat against the sides of his head as his eyes narrowed down into thin slits, even as they lightly flickered between gold and crimson before changing back to his normal deep cerulean, fangs bared from a partially open mouth. As the small blonde growled lightly before his legs uncoiled and he launched himself to the street, his landing creating several moving cracks from the impact before standing back up and making his way through to the gates, nodding to both female Uchiha on guard at the gate, even as both smiled back. Kurenai and Anko followed after him, concern etched on their faces at the blonde's foul mood, which only increased after he spotted the clan head strolling towards them, a smirk on his face, but trailing off as he caught sight of the small blonde glaring at him, his fangs slightly barred, tail twitching aggressively behind him, and ears set flat against the sides of his head. The glare continued even after the man walked past, a growl rumbling from the blonde's throat before making his way towards the very home the man was excited. He continued his slightly muted growl, but grew increasingly louder the further inside the house they traveled, before he was nearly snarling, rage etched across his face, fangs tipped outside his mouth, and his eyes flickering from blue to gold as he stalked through the house, the increasing sense of blood and the sounds of terrified pained sobs and whimpers ghosting across his ears. After nearing tearing off the door its hinges, he quickly made his way towards the bruised and battered form of his Motoko Ni-chan, wrapping his arms around the sobbing woman as she buried her face into his chest, her fingers clutching his shirt while his tail gently stroked her back, even, and Anko and Kurenai offered their own support in the way of gentle embraces. The rage he felt buried itself under the surface of his mind, simmering and seething, but held back by concern and love as he looked over her, his eyes tracing the now purpling bruises that mocked her beautiful face, following the shallow cut near her forehead and the corner of her mouth that lay caked with dried blood, along with the finger-like bruising around her throat. As well as her disheveled appearance and the tears pouring from her eyes. Her sorry state incensed him, but there was little he could do, considering it was her husband's doing. considering he was clan head and a member of the council, little could be done around her treatment unless it interfered with her duties of immediate health. He knew already, having brought it before his mother when he came over to play and found her in a similar state several months ago, who took it to council, but they simply stated it was a clan matter and the punishments that the clan head handed out were their own to supervise and thus had little jurisdiction. And the fucker knew it, the blonde seethed, as he always stopped short of disabling her or going farther than her medical training could mend on its own. They held her for several more minutes before her tears abated and then stepped back and she calmed and then ran her hands over her body, glowing with green healing chakra as the bruises faded and the dried blood flaked off and left her healed but downtrodden. The ghost of a smile returned when Naruto hugged her and she tensely returned it before getting to her feet and rearranging her clothing to make herself presentable before leaving with the rest of them. Not a word was spoken between the four of them, but there was little that could be. A small group made their way to the hospital, Naruto grinning as he intertwined his fingers with Mitoko's, the motion causing a slight swing to their joined arms before increasing the amount of swing as speed, turning it into a slight game, bringing a smile to both their faces. They made excellent time making their way to the hospital, but stopped as Naruto played slightly with the automatic doors, jumping in between them when they started closing, only to laugh and step back out as they reopened before pouting as Mitoko scooped him up after several tries while the blonde darted around her smile becoming more genuine as he laughed, ears and tail twitching in time with the small-bodied laughs escaping his mouth. She struggled with the slightly ticklish blonde, trying to hold him as he squirmed around from her, trying to escape the iron grip her hands and arms held him in, but causing little more than having his sensitive ears and tail brushed lightly with her fingers as he struggled. He eventually broke free before dropping to all fours and speeding off like a hunted fox, startling several nurses as they watched the small blonde launch himself over a trolley bed, ducked underneath a trolley carrying medical supplies, backflipped over another bed, and then dodged between their legs and laugh as he was chased after by his companions. They were able to track him for several minutes but lost him as he dodged around a corner. They all blinked as they discovered the hallway branched off in several directions before taking their own routes after the elusive little fox. They met up 10 minutes later at the reception area, having doubled back. They felt their eye twitch in slight annoyance as they found him, happily grinning while a pair of arms encircled around his legs, his arms wrapped around a blonde, heavily busted woman's neck, wearing a green jacket with a kanji for gambling on its back, her hair done into a pair of low ponytails. His tail waving behind him in excited glee while he looked on as Shizune gave her report to her mentor and director of the hospital, Tsunade of the Sannin, who held Naruto up with her left arm around the small blonde's legs, while her other hand held a clipboard with several medical charts she studied intently. Tsunade turned back to them, her familiar smirk on her face as she held the blonde, passing the pad back to Shizune before nodding. Her hazel eyes glinted eerily as she studied them, her unoccupied hand on her hip, while Naruto batted at one of her ponytails, an intense look of concentration flooding his face. Playing games again? She chided lightly with a small laugh. Who thinks that a retired Anbu member and a pair of chunin could easily catch a child? Perhaps Tsunade, but this is also Naruto we're talking about on a good day, sometimes even the Anbu have trouble catching him. Mitoko replied back, even, as she retrieved the smaller blonde from the elder one. The hospital director laughed at her comments before making a shooting motion with her hand as turned back to her assistant. Alright, get out of here and have some fun, and Naruto. Yes, Tsunade-ni-chan. The blonde replied innocently. You prank anyone today and I'll tell your mother. She didn't need a repeat of the last several times, considering the village believed her as the only other person beside his mother who could control the little bugger, which was true, but they didn't really need to know that, like switching out the Anbu's coffee filters with used underwear scraps. Or dousing the Inyazuka dogs and their owners with distilled liquid catnip essence. Or stealing Anko's Icha book and then questioning his mother about several words and situations in the book, which he repeated back with picturesque clarity. Tsunade grimaced at the memory, remembering the face of shock and horror on Kushina's face as little Naruto crawled into her lap, the Icha book held tightly in his small hands before opening it and asking what Amanto, harder, faster, fuck me harder, meant. Anko wasn't home for a week, having spent the time running for her life after the irate mother chased after her, swing that damned sword of hers, as well as fling and foul curses that a sailor would blush at, all the while Naruto laughing as he watched his mother tear up the village. After catching Anko, she proceeded to tan her hide after dragging her home and while issuing her punishment, demanded that she either throw the books away or seal them up tighter than the fox inside her son. She liked Icha, but her son didn't need to know about those books until he was in his late teens at the least. The blonde already knew about this, his mother telling him the story last year with trepidation, and much to their surprise was bouncing off the wall asking excitedly if he got other gifts from it besides the awesome ears and tail. He grinned, fangs glinting in the sun, as he ran and tumbled through the grass, laughter escaping him as Anko caught up to the energetic blonde, tackling him to the ground, rolling head over heels several times, and landing on her back, the kid held tight with one arm to her chest, the other tickling him mercilessly. Kurenai smiled from her perch on a branch before dropping to the grass below, making her way towards the now wrestling pair with a sedate pace and a smile on her face. Motoko smiled as she watched the two of them as well. Anko twitched as Naruto struggled in her grip as she finally pinned him to the ground, an errant breeze wafting its way across the clearing. Naruto froze, his ears twitching and pupils darting around before his face scrunched up cutely in slight confusion. Anko raised an eyebrow at his inquisitive behavior before yelping as the blonde buried his feet into her stomach and launched himself from her grip, freeing himself before landing in a crouch on all fours. Naruto-kun. What? What is it? Anko questioned, growing worried as the blonde continued to ignore her in favor of whatever had captured his attention to the east before he dug his claws into the earth and sped off towards the forest with the three shocked kunoichi following. They had never seen him act like this and it bothered them. Naruto could become angry and irritated, that was true, but he seemed driven, suspicious this time. They caught up to him a few hundred meters into the forest, crouched on the ground on his hind legs, claws dug into the ground as his tail lashed behind him in curiosity, slitted eyes staring intently at three large sphere-shaped black sacks lathered with ichor and slime, sat against a tree. Naruto was approaching the spheres cautiously, carefully setting each of his clawed appendages in front of himself, head low to the ground, and slitted eyes focused on the objects as he slunk closer, as if stalking an invisible prey. Naruto Kurenai warned gently as the blonde tapped one of the spheres with a claw-tipped finger when he was within reach, before quickly backing off several feet before moving back towards it and tapping it again thoughtfully, a small trail of slime traveling back with it. Satisfied, Naruto placed both hands against the object before blinking as he felt something thumb through his hands. Tilting his head to the side in curiosity, the part kitsune placed his head against the side of the black object before blinking in surprise as he turned to his sisters. Hey, Kurenai ni-chan, come here. This thing, it's got a heartbeat. His excited comment left the three kunoichi stumped. They glanced nervously at one another before Anko and Kurenai moved their way towards the boy, Anko's hand drifting upwards into her trench coat sleeves for her knives, while Kurenai's own tapped against the kunai pouch at her side, while Motoko stayed back a few yards as she activated her Sharingan. The three black in each eye slowly rotating as her hand drifted to her lower back. They were generally not this paranoid in their own village, but the situation in front of them was screaming so much wrong that they were subconsciously preparing for the worst, even if the situation didn't look like it was dangerous. That, and the small blonde they were tensely making their way towards had this mistaken belief that dangerous things were actually fun to play with. Like 3 weeks ago when Anko had snuck the boy off to the forbidden forest with her for the day and spent the rest of it protecting him from a pack of house-sized tigers that he'd pissed off by tugging on their tails when they were sleeping. And the little brat thought it was funny, laughing his ass off the entire time they spent hiding and running from the bastards, at least until Kurenai found them and sent the bastard cats into a coma with one of her nasties in her collection. They hadn't gone back since. Kurenai was closest to the spheres when one of them split open at the top and then peeled backwards, with 4 petal-like tips, looking not unlike a bulbous slime-covered dark flower in appearance now. She noticed that it was actually hollow, with a sickly chalky white inner coating. Kurenai warily looked down at it, keeping a slight distance, her eyes narrowing as something moved around inside it. Naruto was now sitting on his hunches near her legs, a curious look on his face as he studied her face. She smiled at them, her eyes only leaving the sacks for a brief second. Kurenai. Motoko screamed at her before something hurtling at her face launched from inside the sack. Motoko's viewpoint. The Uchiha matriarch narrowed her eyes as they recorded the small chakra spike from the sack and, as she examined it closer, noticed multiple lines of thin chakra running through it before they pulled themselves into a small crab-like shape, quickly becoming saturated with the chakra. What the hell? She thought as Kurenai stepped towards the sack before screaming out a warning towards her as the thing inside of it propelled itself outwards, aimed at her face. Motoko cursed under her breath as her hands were halfway through Kaiten Jutsu. She stopped in shock as a blonde furry tail slammed into the thing sideways and sent it sprawling away from the jounin before it jerked back as Anko nailed it to the tree behind it with 3 kunai, the body twitching. It had 9 spindly finger-like legs flailed around its upper half while a long rat-like tail twisted and whipped around beneath it. Pinkish sacs pulsed like miniature lungs at its sides while a tube-like mouth poked out from the middle of its body. Yellow blood seeped from the wounds, but the trio of kunoichi watched in slight curiosity as the blood ate away at the tree, the kunai wounding it, and even the creature's own body, both smoking and melting as the blood made quick work of the body, even as Mitoko's Sharingan recorded it all. Acidic blood, what the fuck is that thing? Her eyes tracked towards another chakra burst, and they widened in horror as another pod opened itself up like a deadly flower. Right beside Naruto's head. Naruto turned his head towards the sound and he curiously stuck his head over the rim. He watched as what looked like a tail uncurled itself from around a milky white ball, even as his head was jerked back by a terrified Kurenai. He barely felt the tug as another of the things jumped towards him and attached itself to his face before what felt like a rope winded itself around his neck, his hands reaching up towards his face to pry it off before the rope around his neck tightened and he lost consciousness amid his name being screamed by his sisters. The end. Thanks for watching my video and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description. See you next time, till then sayonara.